When I first started painting the bush, one of the initial sort of issues I had to face was it's glowing, it's giving off light in a predominantly lit daytime scene. So how do we show that fire really burning hot, but also touching on this other sense of it's making sound, like there's speaking that's happening from the bush or around the bush with the bush. You know, in painting this like white hot fire, trying to also capture the fact that the bush had life in it. It wasn't burning up, that there was green, so I tried to kind of bring some green flame into it, which if you study flames and you look at images of fire and stuff, there's all kinds of colors and stuff that, you know, that are in fire. But then I started to begin thinking about this sort of like glow or signal, if you will, that was sort of coming out of the bush that would symbolize the sound coming off of it. And it gave me this fun thought of it being like a beacon, like it was this signal that had a space around it, you know, and there was a space around it because there was a certain point in which Moses got to the bush that God went, whoa, too far. Take your shoes off. Like, and so there was this kind of like space around the bush, you know. So from a scientific standpoint, as all of these subject matters are playing together and around each other, the ground that, you know, we're told that the Israelites walked on between the parting of the Red Sea was dry. Well, if you know anything about oceanography or, you know, bodies of water, like the ground beneath the water is wet for several feet. And so the idea of the Israelites walking across dry ground that was underneath a sea is insane, like is absolutely insane. Like, you know, in my imagination, in my mind's eye, I imagined like the ground being so dry, God was proving to them that it was dry, like that it was like insanely dry, that they were walking across this bone dry ground. Okay, now put a plant in that, which takes the whole idea to a whole nother extreme. That's where the medium then is able to speak to us because we've put these two stories together that weren't connected, but now they're playing off of each other and they're creating an even, you know, for a moment, a deeper realization and a more of a depth. And so when you see plants, you know, growing in the desert, you can see images of like bushes growing off the side of mountains, the roots go in all these wild directions because they have to find water, so they're looking for water. So I liked the idea of the bush, you know, being this kind of gnarled, twisted thing because it's diving through the cracks looking for water. I like the sandals because I feel like there's so many different ways in which you're open to interpreting them, the way that I interpret them. Even though there, you know, one could argue that, you know, I didn't come up with it no more than you came up with it. Like it just sort of between the conversation and us planning this, it came about that it would be incredible to have a pair of sandals that were singed. So in one thought about sort of what they mean or what they look like, you know, what it's about, is that you can get too close. And sometimes in experiencing God's presence, touching on God's desires for us, it leaves a mark on us. I think oftentimes we kind of oversimplify it or generalize it and say, well, things happen for a reason. But you know, tell that to someone who just lost a limb. But there's something to be said about, I mean, gosh, there's all these times throughout Scripture where, you know, I love the idea, who was the one that had the coal touch their tongue?
Isaiah.
Did it hurt? I mean, like this idea of like, he was given a gift, but it was like a gift through a pain or a marking. I don't know. Like that's the thing. It's like I don't even have like a packaged sort of idea or feeling about it that I could say this is what this means. But I think there's something to be said about the fact that before, like, what if before he took his shoes off, he did step over the line? It got too close, you know, but close to something good, close to something powerful, close to something that loved him. Gosh, what an amazing thing, because it's an opportunity to sort of blend together traits of God into one thing. You know, God is all powerful, God's all loving, God's all knowing, God's like a destroyer and a creator. Like we're trying to like squeeze it like together into one little thing just for a second. You know, so you step too close to something that was all of those things combined, and it burned your feet a little bit. Why did we choose to weave the manna and the plague together? Simply put, you know, they're both coming from the sky, but there's something also in the fact that there is this duality between the giving of life and the taking of life, and the fact that they're both related to food. Like they're both food things. So the manna was the gift of food. The locusts were destroying food. And so in the composition, we sought to weave them together almost in this figure eight, dare I say, almost like a DNA that weaves through the sky. And it's this symbol of the interwoven, the interconnectedness of life and death that was God in that time period in the scriptures. The wave of locusts in general, I wonder what it would have sounded like, right? You know, to have that many that would have descended upon fields of a country, you know, to destroy crops. I like the image of the pinned down locust because it calls into question how we study the natural world. You know, you've seen the classic image, or you might have even been in a museum or been in a classroom where butterflies, moths, different types of winged insects have been, you know, pinned to a piece of styrofoam or something, and you see all the colors and the patterns and things. You know, what are you studying when you see something like that, right? Like you're seeing it in its stillness, which really is limiting what you're able to study out of it. You're going to see the way it looks. You're going to study the way it looks, but are you going to be able to study its movement? Are you going to be able to study how it procreates, how it eats? You know, no, because you've taken something that lives in flight and held it down and pinned it down. And so there is this interesting thing too, because the locust in Exodus is coming to devour food as a lesson, and as we are pinning it down as a revealment of Christ, we're basically limiting it. You know, this is the end. Well, this is the sort of human end to Christ's story as a human, in a way, you know. So when we pin the locust down, it's almost like seeing a photograph of the aftermath of an explosion. The explosion's already happened. You're not seeing the sound anymore. You're not hearing the sound anymore. But we are. It's the end of the chaos. It's the end of the destruction. It's the aftermath. That locusts can do no more destruction. You know, can do no more damage. It's ceased. This is an interesting thought too. Think about the perceived chaos and destruction that Christ was in the culture that he was in. That's why he was crucified, because he was causing chaos, and they pinned him down. So Mount Sinai is so far away because we're using the illusion of depth to give the viewer a greater understanding of the space itself that the composition is showing you. And it also is utilizing an aspect of the human eye and our ability to communicate and understand images, is that we can fill in the gaps. Okay, so it's pretty amazing that, and you're looking at this scene, you can tell there's a sky and there's a ground, and this little line on the horizon, first of all, your mind can tell it's a horizon, and then the fact that we just put a little bump in it tells us it's a mountain. And so what an interesting thing to say as little as possible and communicate something so big. And then there's also this opportunity there to make a statement about really what should be the largest object in the composition, making it the smallest. All throughout this project, and the piece itself, we're trying to turn things on their head, literally, some of them. This whole composition, right, is about the fulfillment of Christ through Exodus, and through all the different facets of Exodus too, right? It's not just like a person or a thing or a symbol, or it's like the fulfillment in a lot of different ways. And what we know about the way Christ is delivered to us in comparison to other types of God characters throughout time is that he came down to us. And so in the Sinai story, Moses is going up to the mountain. He's climbing up. There is this fire and smoke, and it's like the rock show of the book, right, where there's all this stuff going down, but we get it and we love it and it's exciting, but then Jesus turns it on its head. He turns it upside down, and even to this day it's hard to accept. Like, it doesn't fit the mold, it doesn't fit the model that the deity would become flesh, and the destruction of that flesh would then be the thing that it was all about. It's funny because you put it side by side with the Moses story, and that seems to be it, right? It's like the Ten Commandments and and that was just part of it, like we needed both in order for it to really have the tooth, I love the image of the tabernacle alone in the initial, sort of compositions we're putting it together, because it was big. Gosh, we know that this thing that was erected in the desert, with fabric and rope and trees and stuff, was a big thing. And yet, like Mount Sinai, we make it fairly small and kind of in this empty space, out in the desert. And to erect that tent out in the desert, as it was commanded of them, was an extremely sacred, special thing. Which is kind of fun to think about too, of God commanding the Israelites to make this structure that then he would embody. What an amazing, the fact that he asked humans to create a space that he would then come down and embody. It's like how the type of trust that he is giving them, the weight and responsibility that you would feel as a person setting the post in the ground, pulling the rope down and spiking it in the sand in the ground, knowing that as we finish assembling this thing, God is going to fill it. I can't even wrap my mind around that. Okay, so then, Jesus comes to fulfill that, right? And in this piece, it's a storm. What we see of the tabernacle in this painting is a skeleton. The the fabric becomes like skin, and it is ripped from the bones, the rods, and it's sort of being tossed about almost by like a desert storm. One of the things you and I were talking about earlier about just sort of the desert as a symbol, the desert as space, is that it's scary because it's a vacuum. It can get hot and cold and extreme temperatures, and you can easily lose your way. And so we're sort of really exposing how fragile, how delicate that tabernacle really was as it was later constructed in human form through Christ. God asked us to build it, and then Christ came and completely took it apart. So we pivoted a little bit on the hand and the waves. So typically, when you would see a painting of a crucifix in art history, it's front and center. These were used as altar pieces in Catholic churches. It was a thing that was meant to be central, to worship. But man, the deeper we dive into the story of Christ's death, it was pretty mundane, run of the mill. They killed guys before him. They killed guys after him. He was just another guy. And so there's something about this hand that's just kind of off to the side that's pretty, for the most part, lifeless. It looks lifeless. Laying on the ground, behind one of the folds of the waves, off to the side. And we see the subtle nail hole that just tells us whose hand it is. But it's cast aside. It's a body cast aside. And that's how he was. I draw a lot of inspiration from the early surrealists, and what I find to be very entertaining, in sort of the truest sense of the word entertaining, is informative too, entertaining, is that they allowed multiple topics, multiple genres, multiple subject matters to all exist in one space. So you could talk about love, you could talk about time, you could talk about enemies, you could talk about politics, all on literally the same plane, the same stage. And in doing that, one informs another. Because something is sitting next to something else, it gives that thing new meaning. It also is a reference to the way we are told that God perceives space-time in relation to how we perceive space-time. So I think as believers, when we read the scriptures, it's easy to read a line and it says, and then they wandered for 400 years, and then then the next generation experienced this. All of the time that was happening in that scripture, that one scripture encompassed, so many stories. And so when we see a composition like this where everything is happening all at once, it's that reminder of this is that long game. Like, this is God's long game, and that's really the way it is. I think it's a physical manifestation of the space-time discussion that we're trying to have with the subject matter in general, and sort of having them all together in one space, is showing that to our story, the story, all stories, there's multiple axes involved in them. This path that we're on is not a straight line. It's not a linear one. I remember in school studying the zigzagged line of God's providence through Scripture, through the Old Testament, and some of the stories were big. You're talking about the lineage of a king, But then there's I believe it's in the book of Ruth, where basically the connection to Christ is not until like the last couple of verses. So and so begat so and so begat so and so, which was in the family of David. It's a footnote. That story has implications to other things about our faith, but as it's connected to Jesus, it's like this weavy, line. And so I think there's something to be said about having all of these things kind of floating in front of the big piece, so that as the viewer is standing in front of it, so if you were actually standing in front of it, there may be that sweet spot that you stand in where it all makes sense. And that could be said about moments in our lives. There was times when everything made sense. We don't always 100% feel like we get it. We probably rarely ever feel like we get it. But there are those moments. We talk about the stars aligning. We talk about, when everything was in its right place. You and I were discussing the other day about those moments where it seems like you put your phone camera down and you turn your brain camera on, because there's something about that moment that you're seeing that has this poetic quality to it, and you're going to need it. You're going to want it. And so I think that's why we've sort of had these things sort of floating and suspended in this space, is because seeing them from different angles is going to tell us something different. Even in the paintings themselves, I tried to depict things that were kinetic, that were floating, that were suspended in air. We are catching a snapshot of this, just enigma, of information. Hardest one to paint was probably the foot. So human anatomy is tricky, and I'm not even going to sit there and say that's an excellent painting of a foot. That's an excellent painting of a hand. Human anatomy is tricky in that it's different. Everyone's hands and feet are different. They come in all shapes and sizes. Skin tones are challenging. All these things are very, and feet particularly, because there's all these fine muscles and bones and things that are sticking through the skin and all this kind of stuff. And so throughout the composition, we're playing with depth. We're trying to make things appear as if they're coming towards you, or they're going back, or they're being pushed and pulled and things. And so to create this foot that looks like it is lightly sort of stepping into our world, coming towards us, the toe is kind of gently touching the ground, and it has the overshadowing of the bowl. So the bowl is casting a slight shadow on it, on the arch of the foot, the front arch of the foot, as it's stepping down. That was tough, getting all the little angles and things just right. But it's also, for me, it's one of the more rewarding ones, because it really does kind of challenge our perception a little bit on, is it a hole? Is it a bowl? Is it where exactly is this foot coming from? My favorite thing about the painting, I like the one that's closest to us, of the bread being broken with the orbiting halo of the crown of thorns. And the reason I like it is because it touches on a painting, really, that's kind of been done by thousands of artists before me. I really like thinking about and approaching types of work that connect me as an artist in this century to the artists that predate me, because I feel like art in itself is one long conversation. It's about humans' experience of the earth, and what the human experience is at different times. And so I like painting things that were painted by other people as a way to show a growing understanding of that thing. And so there's something celestial about it, because it's not sitting on the ground. It's not sitting on a table surrounded by a bowl of fruit. It's floating. It's in free fall. Something is breaking it. It's breaking itself. And then the crown of thorns, it looks like it's orbiting. It's like a rings of Saturn, which is not something that I feel like I've seen very often in terms of how the crown of thorns is treated. I tried to sort of like blend the concept of a crown of thorns and a halo. It has a sort of historical, kind of touches on my my love for nostalgia and art history, and I feel like it encompasses what this project is about, and why we're doing it.